Good afternoon from Vienna, or should I rather say good morning to our panelists and anyone who is joining us from overseas. Welcome to the second episode in our OIIP online series, A Brand New World, Shifting Powers in International Politics, which is also part of, this episode is also part of the lecture series of the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, which is called the IPW Lectures. Our event today is on the US elections 2020, and we ask the question, what future for democracy, social movements, and human rights? And I'm sure that many of you have already been to their fair share of US election events in the past days and weeks. But I can promise you, I'm very confident that this one will be like unlike any other you've already been to, because we have two outstanding guests who I will introduce in more detail in a minute. We have Professor Diva Woodley from the New School for Social Research in New York City, and we have Professor Tina Kempit-Reuter from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. My name is Saskia Stahovic. I am the Scientific Director of the OIIP, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, and I'm also faculty member at the Department of Political Science, and it is my honor and pleasure to be your chair today. The OIIP, for those who are joining us for the first time, is an independent research institute with 40 years of scholarship and policy relevant expertise in the areas of international security, Europe and its neighborhood, transformations of democracy and new authoritarianisms, extremism and de-radicalization, gender and security, and global innovation policies. A traditional focal area of the Institute has also been transatlantic relations and US foreign policy, a legacy that is particularly associated with our former director, Professor Heinz Gärtner. And in his honor, we therefore every year hold an annual event that is dedicated to these issues. And of course, this year, these issues can only be the congressional and presidential elections in the US. Heinz, I cannot see if you're here, but I assume so. It is a pleasure to have you. And before we get started, let me also thank our cooperation partners for this event, the US Embassy in Vienna and the Austrian Ministry of Defense. I will briefly introduce our guests, and we will then hear their opening remarks, talk a little bit about those inputs on the panel, and then open the floor to as many of your questions as we possibly can. You will be able to post them in the chat function of the Zoom webinar. And my colleague Clemens Binder is joining us here to support us in collecting and organizing these questions. There he is. We're planning to finish all of this within 90 minutes at 6:30. All right, as promised, a brief introduction of our guests. We will start with Tina Kempin-Reuter, who is the director of the Institute for Human Rights and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and also in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She specializes in her research in human rights, peace studies, international politics, and she has studied human rights from various different perspectives, always with a particular focus on marginalized groups and on the struggles of vulnerable people, working through how can we get more inclusion. More recently, she has looked at the connection between urban developments, marginalized groups, and human rights. Just to mention one paper entitled Human Rights in the City in the Journal of Human Rights. She's also an expert on ethnic conflict and peacemaking with a focus on Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. I think her work is very interesting in that it crosses the traditional boundaries in our discipline, political science, those boundaries between the domestic and foreign policy issues. And I'm looking forward to hearing, her thoughts from a broad perspective on human rights as this intersectional policy issue. Further, we have Diva Woodley here. She is an associate professor of politics at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And her work, again, does not fit neatly into the boxes that we like to organize our discipline in, and bridges political theory and empirical driven research on current social issues. She looks at democratic politics and focuses on the shifts in public meaning and the problem definitions within a polity. So basically, how do we make sense of politics? How do the members of a polity define politically valuable, desirable, normal? And what does this mean for political change and for social movements? She has a book with, I think, Oxford University Press that addresses just that. It's entitled The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. And her most recent publication is entitled Black Feminist Visions and the Politics of Healing in the Movement for Black Lives. This is in an edited volume entitled Women Mobilizing Memory. And beyond that academic output, she also contributes regularly through essays and blog articles and, to current discussions about structural discrimination against Black people, social justice issues, and recent protest movements in the US. Welcome both. I'm very, very happy you could make it. And I would ask Tina to start with her opening remarks.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. It's my honor and pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to share some of my insights into, surviving, I guess, in some ways, this electoral cycle in the middle of a pandemic. And I just want to start by saying that overall, the US is an established democracy, and that the elections, however controversial they were, proved that. They did show, however, the real deep divisions and the issues we have with the process. So if we look at the US in relations to other liberal democracies like Austria, for example, right? The US is definitely an outlier with regards to its human rights and democracy record. So while the US is an established democracy, there are some troubling patterns that have emerged in the last decades. If we look at some leading data sources on democracy, like the Varieties of Democracy data set or Freedom House, we note that the strength of US democracy has significantly declined over the past decade or so. So, for example, the Varieties of Democracy data set placed the US in the category of what it calls autocratizing countries. So the US has suffered a 15% decline in democracy from 2008, that's when Barack Obama was elected, to 2019, 3 years into the Trump administration. This is exceptional in terms of how much and how fast a country has moved towards autocracy, especially because the US is usually considered an established democracy, as I just mentioned. It puts us in a troublesome company with India and Brazil and some other countries that have backslid. And the US is, in fact, the only long-standing developed democracy in this category, which is particularly worrying. If we look at Freedom House indicators on political rights, right, when we talk about elections, we usually talk about political rights. It ranks the US between El Salvador and just below Jamaica. So this is not good. Okay, this is not good. So while the roots of our democracy may run deep, there are definitely signs of concerns for both the state of our democracy in general, and as well as human rights in particular. And then if we consider the US size and international influence in terms of economic, military, strategic, and other types of power, the ripple effect of the US decline, are potentially huge. I mean, we see some of this already when we think about the US role in the United Nations or the exit from the WHO, and some of the issues, international relations issues that we dealt with in the last couple years, basically 4 years. Now, in terms of the particular shortcomings regarding elections, voting rights, and those kinds of things, there are a number of issues to be mentioned. First of all, and this probably doesn't come as a surprise to you, there's multiple scores note that the electoral college system itself runs counter to the equal representation aspects of democracy and international human rights law. And along similar lines, the issue of gerrymandering is widely criticized, again, for the same reasons, violating equal representation concerns. The eminence of foreign influence in US elections is widely noted as a weakness, and especially the unwillingness to respond to such influence. Voter registration is an issue. You probably know this, but the responsibility is on the citizen to get approved to vote, meaning that the default is not being registered, not voting. So this is unlike pretty much any other liberal democracy where, you turn 18 or 20 or whatever the voting age is, and you're automatically registered, where the default is voting, right? Whether you return the ballot or whether you actually show up is your, that depends on your personal opinion or motivation. But in the US, the default is you're not registered to vote. You cannot vote. And then there is obviously the contentious issue of voter suppression and the disenfranchisement of felons in the US, which are two things that are most directly at odds with international practices regarding elections. So things like voter ID requirements and the closing of voter stations in minority areas, or criminals forfeiting the right to vote for a really broad range of offenses, and then maintaining these penalties even after the person has completed their incarceration. So these are some of the really big issues. Some of these structural issues are more pronounced in the Deep South, which is where I live. I live in Alabama, where I guess in the whole region we see some voter behavior patterns and voter suppression practices that go back to slavery and after the Civil War, Jim Crow laws that violently restricted Black Americans' rights to vote. And when not violent, there were often manipulative practices to restrict voting rights for Black Americans. And in some ways, the issues that surround voting rights and representation today are still linked to a lot of these practices. Even some of the discussions we had with regards to voting options in the era of COVID-19, like early voting, vote by mail, drive-through voting, and so on, relate to that time. Unlike some of the states in the US West, like Colorado or Washington State, Oregon, and so on, we didn't have early voting or ballots mailed directly to your home. You had to actually request it or show up in person. The Alabama Supreme Court suspended curbside voting, thereby restricting access. And we know that this specifically affects the poor and racial and ethnic minorities. I assume Diva might go a little bit more into this later. So the effects of some of these issues are really profound. And while Black turnout has increased into the South over the last decade or so, it's still behind white turnout, and largely because of some of these structural issues. And this is why Biden's win in Georgia is so remarkable, and why the work by Stacey Abrams and others is so extraordinary. So while our democratic experiment has evolved over time, there remain major flaws in the way we conduct elections. Now, the other thing that I would say is really front and center is probably also not something that surprises you, but this is really this idea of increasing partisanship and identity politics. Living in the US, especially I live outside of Birmingham, which is the largest city in Alabama. Usually the city itself is Democratic. I live slightly outside in the suburbs where, it's about maybe 60-40 in favor of Republicans, but then surrounded by a deeply red state. Like these divisions are real and they're really hard to overcome, especially as we drift more and more into political sectarianism, like a place where politics are treated like religion, and people on the other side aren't just wrong, or their perspective on policy is wrong, but they're considered evil, criminal, and to be distrusted and despised. And I saw this play out in my own hometown. I'm going to out myself here. I had Biden-Harris sign in my yard, and I had to take it down shortly before the election because some of my friends' houses were vandalized or firecrackers thrown into their yards. I have 2 young children, and I didn't want them to be exposed to those kinds of things. But this is a relatively quiet community. Usually, these kinds of things we don't see, right? We don't see, and the emotions are high, and they continue to be. So we seemingly have 2 Americas with 2 very different narratives. The sides are entrenched and drifting farther apart because, I don't know, social media, different media outlets, and there's misinformation that's purposeful and partisan, and whatever story is communicated is experienced as the truth, like with a capital T. And this has been on full display during this election cycle, and also in the US response to COVID-19. Before the webinar started, we actually talked briefly about this, like where I live, wearing or not wearing a mask outs you as a follower of a particular political ideology. So politicization and misinformation around COVID are tragic real world consequences of this divide. All of this will make it really hard for the incoming administration. And obviously there's the fact that nearly half of voters chose more of what we've seen during the Trump administration and more of Trump himself. Like the idea that 2016 was just a historical fluke, an outlier, a little backlash against the first Black president, or a vote against Hillary Clinton, or her emails, who knows, no longer stands. So voters have shown that they like what Trumpism stands for. And in some ways, the outcome of the 2016 election is a pretty accurate reflection of what about half of the American electorate wants. So for many, and especially white people, right, who voted for Trump at rates of 58% or something like that, racism, sexism, xenophobia, bigotry, and lies were not a deal breaker. And this is really hard to grapple with. And this is, I guess, the big question of how will the Biden administration address some of these domestic issues while facing a world ravaged by a pandemic and bouts of uncertainty. I think domestically, a lot will depend on how Biden addresses racism, oppression, and how he will address the divisions in American society. I guess it will depend on whether he will be able to facilitate the conversation that we so desperately need. We do see some indication of this, maybe through his appointments, and also through his rhetoric of being an American president for all, and sort of the calming voice he's had, especially on Twitter, right? If we compare it to Trump's presence on Twitter. He has also specifically highlighted certain human rights issues of underrepresented groups. Race is obviously seems to be at the forefront, but then also things like transgender rights and so on. But let me be clear, white supremacy, patriarchy, and oppression will not just magically disappear with a change in the White House, and neither will identity politics. There really aren't any silver bullets. Like, this is the kind of work we as citizens must do every day with our families, in our communities, in schools, at work in state and local government, where maybe some of this change, will happen first, not at the top level, but at the bottom. And in our own minds and hearts, like we must dismantle these myths or the isms that sort of have been ingrained in us. So we need to focus on what unites us. And I think one way to do that is to move away from identity towards policy, and to really focus on policy. And I'm hopeful, looking at Biden's approach so far, that this will be a shift that he's making. Very briefly, with regards to international issues, it is my hope too that Biden administration will repair some of the strained relations with allies in Europe and elsewhere, and that the US will become more of a defender of democracy and human rights than it has been in the last 4 years. I do think some of the selection of, Tony Blinken as a Secretary of State or Linda Thomas Greenfield as UN ambassador are good signs for more diplomacy, and indicate a change from Trump's America First policy. So overall, I'm hopeful, but I think change will be difficult considering the obstacles. And I think the hard part really will be for the new administration to have to work within the system that is, was established to be oppressive in some ways, right? And to not be democratic, and to not, empower people, or especially underrepresented groups, while working within the system while trying to change it. Okay, so finding that balance is really hard, and it will take some tough conversation and some honest, unfiltered, unwashed discussions, and then obviously the understanding what needs to be done in order to fix some of those things that are broken. All right, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for this reality check, hopeful reality check. Diva, would you like to jump right in?
Yes, thank you, Saskia. Thank you for the invitation here. I'm very excited and intrigued to be in conversation with folks from around the world and in Vienna. And thank you, Tina, for those opening comments. I agree with so much of it. So let me begin by affirming the things that Tina has said about the sort of political situation and divides that exist in the American context. But I have to say that this divide, particularly the racial divide in the United States, is not new. It is endemic. It is a part of what the United States is, right? It's sewn right into the founding. We see the initial issues in the constitutional foundation of this country. What has happened in the past decade is that people have been primed to understand much of politics through, or sort of to evaluate politics through the lens of race and racism, whether or not they acknowledge it. So what we have is the rise of white identity politics that is grievance-based, but also it's not economically grievance-based per se, but it's actually culturally grievance-based, right? These are where the sort of appeals to my America and Make America Great Again have their resonance, right? And this idea of America as a white Christian, patriarchal and capitalist nation, at its essence, as something that should be reinforced rather than move beyond, right? So that's the kind of root of one kind of sort of identity politic that's going on that is sort of newly resurgent, right? This is not the first time we see it in America, but it is newly resurgent in this moment. At the same time, and I should say that I partially reject the framing of identity politics because all politics are identity politics, including class politics. People see politics, interpret politics, give meaning to politics, right? Aside from a set of technical procedures, because their ideas of themselves and their vision for what they want the nation and the world to look like are invested, right, in those procedures. Otherwise, we just, could sort of have government by computers or something like that, right? So all politics are invested with our identities and our ideas about the world and ourselves. So at the same time that there's been this rise in sort of white grievance politics over the last decade, and this didn't start with Trump, right, but actually started, and we see this in a sort of changes in public opinion data, right, under President Obama as a reaction to, I think, his really rather mild administration. At the same time, also during that period, has been the rise of a Black politics and the reinvigoration of the Black liberation social movement that is very broadly based, right, the movement for Black lives, but has been sparked and in some cases sustained, at least as sort of mass mobilizations in the streets, by the continuation of severe and not always lethal, but often lethal police violence that is happening in the streets. Also not a new phenomenon, but one that has been recorded and sort of monitored in a new way in the last decade. So we have these things coming together. In addition to, and this is also important, soaring economic equality, which just keeps increasing. This is happening around the world. It's a global phenomenon, but it's particularly severe in the United States. We sort of see it even more starkly in the COVID era, when the US stock market has reached its highest highs, its highest historical highs, at the same time that wages have been stagnant for 20 years and unemployment is at an astronomical amount, and without a stimulus from our federal government to support restaurants, small businesses, and state governments, will become dramatically more intense over this winter, right? So we see so many lines of division that are intersecting in our society and creating the conditions under which people are trying to make sense of the world. And the available lenses that they have are ones that emphasize politics as a zero-sum game, right? As a way where, or as a situation in which if you win, I lose, and if I win, you lose, right? And that is what has sort of created the conditions under which we begin to see each other not as opponents, but rather as enemies, right? Now, I don't want to push too hard on this notion, right? Because there's a situation, there's a sort of, I don't want to push too hard and too fast on the sort of like need to unify, right, over these differences, because the truth is that they are real differences, and there are real situations in which certain positions that people take, are truly inhumane, right? The idea that we shouldn't be upset by migrant children being separated from their parents at the border, and like finally separated from them, right? They are not going to be reunited when they are sort of adopted into American adoption agencies and given to other people, right? When their parents have been deported, like this is truly a human rights disaster. Opinion differences on issues like that do start to seem like values differences, but also life and death issues, right? Similar to the case of, people who think it's not a big deal that if you are a Black American, you are, 3 times more likely to be murdered in the street by a police officer, right? A representative of the state who then will not be held accountable, right? The likelihood that that person would be held accountable for misconduct is very low. So these are very serious issues that people are right to see as life and death. So rushing to unity is also sort of not the answer. Yet democracy is not sustainable when we see opponents as enemies, right? And we see politics as war, right, rather than as politics. So it is a very tough circle to square, right? But I do think that there are ways to mitigate and get back to, or maybe create for the first time, an inclusive democratic society. And I see signs of that happening already. So going back a little bit to some of the things that Tina said, it is absolutely true that we have structural issues, right? And although the United States is a longstanding democracy, I am not sure that this election showed, even though the outcome is very decisive, that our institutions are particularly strong. I think our institutions are rather fragile, and they've been shown to be fragile in a variety of different ways. If not for a sort of handful of Republican officials who decided to put country over party, right, in this election, and the massive turnout of people who voted for Democrats at the national level, right? The fact that it wasn't close, right? It wasn't close. And some people chose country over party is the thing that allowed this election to proceed in something like a free and fair way. Although the voter suppression issues that Tina mentioned are very, very live, are very much in force. So, you know, and there's no guarantee that that will happen again, right, is my point, is that our institutions will not ensure that the next election will be relatively free and fair, right? Because so many of our points of electoral decision are bipartisan rather than nonpartisan, right? That's another thing, right? That you have to have officials who, in many states, in most states, who are aligned with a particular party as a part of the decision to simply certify votes, right? To simply certified votes. And those people will always be under cross pressures. And in this age particularly, will be under cross pressures to make sure their guy, right, or woman, but usually guy, is the one who is installed, right? No matter what the sort of facts on the ground say. So this is a moment of incredible fragility from which our institutions cannot save us. But instead, organized people have to save us. The good news is there's a ton of organizing going on. And that, for me, is the story of the 2020 election. Now, let me say a little bit about this phenomena of political organizing. Political organizing is the process of engaging, analyzing, meeting, discussing, educating, and acting with people over time, okay? And it's actually a phenomenon that gets relatively short shrift in political science, right? We often talk about mobilizing, which is different, right? Rather than organizing. We also sometimes talk about activism, even though that is more something that they talk more about in sociology than they do in political science. So we talk about mobilizing, which is getting people who already have the requisite skills and knowledge to do a thing, right? To do a short-term action. So this is when people, you know, from a party, volunteers ring you up a couple of weeks before an election and say, hey, remember to vote on January 5th or whatever the date is. That is people who already have a pattern of voting, people who are already registered to vote, people who already have the requisite identification if it's required. You remind them to turn up, right? That's mobilization. Activism is people who come out into the streets in order to demonstrate a particular set of values or for a particular cause or to register their dissent. But organizing is distinct from those things because it is a process of meeting, relationship building, and political education and action that takes place over time and actually changes people's political subjectivity. And what I mean by that is that organizing is what convinces people that they are the sort of people who can act, rather than mobilizing them to perform a particular action. This means that they're going to be able to improvise, right? So that when new challenges come up, they have a fund of political education, knowledge, and relationships, right? And resources where they can strategize, right? But also react to new circumstances as they they come up. So those who are politically organized are actually the kind of democratic citizen that one wants, right? Because they are the kind of democratic citizen that is actually engaged in politics as it happens and are able to make meaning out of politics as it happens, communicate it to others, and come up with creative political solutions, okay? Political organizing is the reason that Georgia in the American South went blue for the first time in 20 years. And it is because of a long-term organizing strategies that people in that state, notably Stacey Abrams, but also Latasha Brown, of Black Voters Matter, and Insee Ufot of the New Voter Project, have been working on for a decade, right? For 10 years. And this process of engagement is a kind of inductive way of doing politics. And when I say an inductive way of doing politics, I mean that it is bottom up, right? It's from specific and local, right? And then your interest turns to the national rather than top down, where the national party rings you up and says, hey, this is our platform, support us because the other guys are horrible, right? And that was deductive sort of way to do politics. Well, it turns out when you're dealing with a populace that is significantly politically disengaged, which is the case, right, or has been the case in the American polity over the last several decades, right? What is called for is not mobilization, which will just reproduce the patterns and intensify the patterns that we already see, which is that people who have a higher socioeconomic status, who tend to be white, and who tend to be also more male, will turn up to do the thing that they have already been politically socialized to do, and other people will try to stay out of the mess, right? When you have a public that is substantially politically disengaged, mobilization is not the key. Organizing is the key, where you bring new people into the fold of democratic politics. And I don't mean large D Democratic Party politics, I mean the democratic process as a whole. And those folks, when they come into the fold, if you're doing political organizing, it's not just about picking between the teams that exist. It's about transforming the political environment, right, into a place where people feel that they can be participants and be represented, right? And that is a long-term process. And it's also the reason why you have to start local rather than at a kind of state or national level. And it's also the reason why it's so deeply effective, because what happens with political organizing is that you create a very deep bench, right, of people who have the political knowledge and skills to be participants and representatives at all levels of government over time, okay? So this is happening on both the left and the right in the United States, right? It's not only the left that is organizing, but this political organizing has had a particular benefit to the left and will continue to do so because the right in our country has been organizing for a long time, right? Largely through standing in religious institutions, and then creating other kinds of institutions that piggyback off of that long-standing kind of institutional structure of religious institutions over the last really 5 decades, right? Because if you know sort of American history, the Republican Party was out of power for a long time after the middle 20th century. And they spent that time organizing, right? People, often through churches and then through other kinds of institutions that they built, right? So think tanks, campaign and recruitment programs, and other kinds of things like that in order to get back into power. Now, over that time, it wasn't only that they were sort of getting people to do the bidding of the existing Republican Party, but those people changed the ideas of the party over time, and then also have been working to make those new ideas, right, many of which have an autocratic flavor, mainstream within the party, right, and a part of what we talk about in our sort of normal diet of public agenda setting, right, in the United States. The left has not done that, right? It hasn't had the opportunity to do that over the last several decades. It also hasn't taken the opportunity, right? But now there is a lot of organizing going on, a lot rooted in social movements led by the Movement for Black Lives, but also watch out for these young people in the Sunrise Movement. They are so organized and smart. March for Our Lives, Me Too, the Women's March. The left has sort of caught on to the idea that not only do we need to protest, but we also need to build movement institutions where we are doing an outside-inside strategy, as Tina's talking about. So you have social movement organizations who focus on direct service to communities, protest and demonstration, right, direct action, but you also have institutions that are involved in what the Movement for Black Lives calls electoral justice, which are responsible for recruiting and grooming new candidates, teaching people how to staff campaigns, teaching people how to raise money for campaigns outside of the party establishment, which is actually usually quite unfriendly to outsiders trying to hone in on their territory. Right. And that infrastructure is what's being built right now and has already proven itself to be very successful at actually changing outcomes in elections. But there's also a struggle that's going on there. And this is very normal. It's not only on the left, this also happened on the right. There's a struggle about ideas, right? That is going on there, because as more people come into the political process, especially from marginalized communities, their ideas of what is just and how we have to think about justice are really different. So for example, in the Movement for Black Lives, there is a sort of political philosophy that that believes that justice, and I call this political philosophy radical Black feminist pragmatism, but it is a political philosophy that that thinks about justice from the point of view of the most marginalized, right? And there's a sort of saying in the movement that those who are the closest to pain should be the closest to power, right? And that means that people who suffer the most at the intersection of social forces, racism and white supremacy, economic inequality and oppression, patriarchy, right, should be the people who are the ones who are thinking through how is it that we can create a society where everyone can live and thrive? Because if you don't reason from the perspective of the people who are in the most pain, then you actually don't get to solutions that can liberate everybody, right? That can free everyone, that can create a world in which thriving is possible for all. And we see that sort of happening, right, as movement-aligned candidates and movement-backed candidates. So for example, the very first congresswoman who came out of the politicization of the Movement for Black Lives was elected from the state of Missouri, where the Ferguson uprising happened, Cori Bush, just this last cycle, right? There are other candidates who are aligned with the movement, but didn't necessarily come out with the movement, right? Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York. And these are folks who are broadly aligned with the movement that didn't necessarily come out of the movement, but all of these people are pushing the Democratic Party to look at things in a new way, and there is some tension there, okay? But that tension is not necessarily a bad thing, right? As long as it doesn't fracture the party. Because the truth is, politics is agonistic, right? It is a contentious process. The question is whether or not that contention can be healthy, right? And continue movement, or whether that contention becomes toxic and prevents movement, right? And that is just progress, right? Our ability to go into the future is what I mean by that. So things are pointing in several different directions at this critical juncture. We have an incredible amount of possibility in front of us at the same time as there's an incredible amount of danger, right? It is absolutely the case that the United States is capable of sliding in an autocratic direction. We already have. It's possible that more of that can happen, right? Absolutely. it is also the case that it is possible that we can see a revolution of democratic politics in the United States, in which we have an unprecedented number of people who are engaged in the political process and who are shaping policy and the polity in era-defining ways, right? So, this is a moment in which everything is at stake. And what we see is, and for a small D Democrat like me, I think this is always the case, but what we see is that the people are really in the driver's seat. And that means it really matters. It really matters how people are organizing in their own communities, what kind of politics they are dreaming and imagining and implementing where they are, and how and whether people are able to scale that up. And we see very interesting and creative things happening, particularly in this COVID era. There's been an explosion in interest in and carrying out of, for example, mutual aid, right? Mutual aid collectives and organizations and coordination in the United States has gone up exponentially over the last 8 or 9 months. This was something that was never a big sort of political process in the United States. People were not particularly interested in mutual aid, even in sort of left or liberal circles. But now you see amazing sort of coordination of friendly fridges, which is places like refrigerators that are placed in the community where you just leave food and take food as you need it, community pantries, leave a little, take a little. And these things are popping up in communities all over the United States, but there's also a coordination apparatus that has popped up, right, to make this a kind of viable strategy, right, of political organization, not just for the COVID moment, but going forward, right? Because that's the cool thing about political organization, is that people learn and people take these tactics with them and they can apply them and scale them, right, as situations warrant. So we have to see what happens going forward. But I have to say on the whole that I'm optimistic, because at the same time that 2 million Americans, as Tina said that they wanted more of the Trump era, right? Almost 81 million Americans said, no, thank you. Yeah, no more of this, thank you very much. And not only that, it's not only a representation of a rejection of Trump, which it is, but it's also a reputation of engagement with politics. And for me, the things that define the 21st century, the ideas and practices that define the 21st century, will come from the folks who are learning and engaging with politics now, and who are pushing past the limits of what we thought was possible in the 20th century in terms of creating structural conditions in which most people in most places can live and thrive. This also means, I think, transcending some of the human rights frameworks that we have had in the past. Things that think about, for example, the notion of equality, especially equality as sameness, right, as something that is the chief aspiration, or the notion that colorblindness is something that is desirable at all, right, rather than anti-racism, for example. Right, this goes for not only issues of race, but also differences of all kinds, right? What if in the 21st century, we start to think about politics as a way to distribute responsibilities for care, right? Or sort of like a politics of care, where the idea is not that we all have to be formally equal before the law, right? We should be equal before the law, but instead what is important is whether or not we can demonstrably live lives that are free and flourishing, right? So this is a moment where our ideas about the meanings of politics and our activities in politics can really change and shift, so that by the time 2080 rolls around, right? I was born in 1979, so by the time that time rolls around, our basic ideas, right, what we take to be common sense about what ought to be, are actually transformed. then that's the win I think that we should be going for. That is the thing that kind of keeps me going, and I think is what is inspiring these organizers that I have been learning from. I should say that I've just finished a book about the movement for Black Lives, but this is sort of what I've learned from them, is that our thinking should be century thinking. It should be era thinking. We should be thinking about what we want the world to be for the person who's, born in the same sort of situation we were born in 100 years from now, right? What opportunities should they have? What should they take to be common sense about the way that we should interact with each other in the world and the way governance should be arranged? We have to be acting for that moment, and we have to be acting for that future that we want for them. And the good news is many, many people are. Will it be enough? Well, that's to be seen. But there's certainly a lot of potential.
Thank you, Diva. Again, a very intense description of what is going on and the directions everything could be going into. Just a few brief things that came to my mind while listening to your comments. Tina, you described this exceptional democratic decline of the US. And I wanted to ask you how do you see that in the context of democratic decline in the West in general? I mean, haven't we seen a move towards authoritarianism globally? And how is the US process positioned within that? Also in terms of what effect could that have on other democratic movements? And a question for both of you. You mentioned voter suppression and what an important topic it is to address. But we've seen this change and shift in the Supreme Court, which will also likely have effects on this issue. So what is the wiggle room even for a Biden administration to change something under the conditions of a Supreme Court that is clearly not leaning towards more inclusion? And then something that Diva said, rushing to unity is not the answer. That's going to stick with me, I think. It's a very interesting thought. But how well will a potential Biden administration be positioned to get us to such an inclusive democratic society? Also, you spoke a little bit about the changes within the Democratic parties and the tensions within that. But on the other hand, you have a very, I would say, radicalized Republican Party. So what are the constraints under which this administration will be able to organize this process of not rushing to unity, but still achieving more balanced politics? And also, what is the relationship there of this administration, or how we can imagine it to be, to what you call the organized people and the Black Lives Matters movement and this idea of bottom-up political change? I mean, is there a good open relationship to be had, and is that going to be, are such organizations and movements, will they have easy access to that kind of high-level politics? And another question, we had Black Lives Matter's solidarity protests all across the world. It was particularly big in Vienna. So Diva, what are your thoughts on global organizing? So how you spoke about the local level and how this then goes to the national level, and what happens if we take this to the global level? What connections can be made here, and how can there be a change even beyond, national polities? Tina, would you like to again go first?
Sure. Yeah, either is fine for me. Well, thanks for those excellent questions. I mean, you're absolutely right. We see a general move towards authoritarianism and autocracies. There's like a larger portion of the world population now lives in autocracies than democracies. I think the first time since 2001 or something like that. I read. So the U.S. is definitely, it's not just the U.S. I mean, you see this in Europe too, with Poland and Hungary and some other places. But what I would say two things is different, right? One is that of the long-standing liberal democracies, the US is kind of the one that went the farthest and the fastest. And again, because I think of its international influence, right? Like if you look, like I'm originally from Switzerland, for those of you who don't know that, right? I still read the Swiss news. The US election was on the front page of the Swiss newspapers, you know, and I'm assume that was the same in Austria. So just the implications, I guess, in some ways, of what happened in the United States, especially after, you know, World War II and onwards, you know, has worldwide worldwide impact, and especially on traditional allies like in Europe. So that's why I'm kind of stressing, you know, those kinds of issues, because I do think they are impactful, and maybe the sort of role model, quote unquote, that Trump has set, right, for other populist leaders, or the things he got away with, right? Which, you know, there were so many firsts, it feels like, in those last 4 years, of, you know, rules that weren't upheld, or even, you know, some common sense issues, right, that were just completely thrown out. You know, so those are the reasons why I'm thinking, you know, what happened in the US, or what's going on even now, like after, you know, as Diva said correctly, I mean, this wasn't a close win, right? It was a big win for the Democrats, but the continued situation where, you know, the Trump administration sets up loyalists in key positions that cannot be replaced, and those kinds of things. The transition not happening as it's usually done, like that will have a ripple effect. With regards to your other question, sort of the voter suppression and the situation of the Supreme Court. One of the things, and this might not be exactly what you're looking for in your answer, but one of the things I find interesting in US election is how this presidential election kind of overshadows everything else. And obviously, yes, the Supreme Court, I mean, this is extremely impactful and should not be minimized. But I kind of want to echo a little bit of what Diva said, like a lot is happening at the local level. And there's not a lot of understanding how important those elections are. I mean, if anything, like if you look at what's happened in this election cycle, the importance of state representation cannot be overstated, right? I mean, they are the ones that make the voter laws in a lot of ways, right? Or the laws that suppress voters, or, you know, empower or suppress them. There's the certification of votes and so on, the gerrymandering. This is what happens at the state level. And so while there might be a lot of you know, importance to the presidential election, obviously a lot more, I guess, political organizing needs to go into the state and local. We do see some of this, right? I mean, some of the even in my hometown, some of the policies that, you know, would not work in the state of Alabama might work at the local level. But like in some ways, while the presidential election is obviously extremely impactful, especially with regards to foreign policy and message and so on, like in order to combat some of those structural issues, we also need to focus on the local and state level.
Yes, picking on this question of the local and state level, we have a federated system. So there's a way in which, and that means that our power is not only, or the political power is not only vested in national politics, but is spread out among the states and municipalities. So for example, something like policing is handled totally at the local level. That is, handled not at the state level, even it's a municipality by municipality. And so things like that are very, very local. That's part of how the movement for Black Lives kind of, got their feet wet in politics. The most impactful and the most immediate political ramifications of that movement were not only the large demonstrations, but also the immediate investment that the movement had in flipping district attorneys, which in most places are elected offices. And these are the folks who bring charges against people in local areas, set policy about how police are supposed to interact with people, what kinds of things will be prosecuted, right? So they have an immediate impact on people's lives. And the movement for Black Lives, as early as 2016, was flipping DAs, right? Kicking out regressive DAs and making room for so-called progressive prosecutors. Now, how progressive you can be as a prosecutor is a thing that is of much debate. But the point is that the kind of law and order rhetoric, which reigned unchallenged, regardless of party, for decades, has been mitigated. And many of the sort of worst offenders have been tossed out of office, usually by resounding margins. So this has also begun to happen on county boards, right? City councils, et cetera. So this is a kind of organizing, and that's not just happening in the movement for Black Lives, because all of these social movements are actually connected, right? That doesn't mean that they're not sort of deciding each other's agendas, but there are lines of communication between social movements that are happening in all parts of the country. And as you note, Saskia, around the world, right? Most of these movements are transnational. Now, these transnational movements don't look like sort of large centralized movements that are sort of, everything's dictated from some central source or some central cadre of leaders. Instead, they're communication networks that share information, toolkits, strategies, tactics, and try to educate each other about the common situations they're facing, as well as the differences that they have based on regular communication. This has been enabled by the communications technologies that we have now that didn't exist right in the middle of the 20th century in the last sort of cycle of contention that looked anything like this in terms of like a global scale. So what you have now is a kind of federated process of social movement, which is super interesting, which is to say that there's no sort of one central sort of coordinator or controlling body. And yet you have people who are consulting with each other and developing, right, through discussion, a common vision of society from their different perspectives, right? And expressly taking into account their differences. And sort of trying to create complementary strategies from that basis of shared values. And they're not sort of pre-existing shared values necessarily. There are sort of broad shared desires, but they're values that are created through discussion, right, in these forums that then people adapt to their local situations. So that's very exciting. And it's something that is ongoing and going on. And as you say, the movement for Black Lives, first of all, from the beginning has understood itself as transnational. So from very early on in 2015 or so, they sent delegations to other places to sort of understand what the global color line was, right? And how Blackness could be understood in different places. So there were delegations that went to Brazil and went to Australia and went to Palestine and, it's much easier to go to London and Toronto, for example, where there's huge, huge sort of chapters of these sort of organizations as well. But from the very beginning, people understood that, white supremacy is a global system, right? The kind of form of capitalism that has been dominating, right? Like kind of neoliberal capitalism, right? Is a global system. Patriarchy is a global phenomenon. right? Even police violence, right, is a global phenomena. So, you know, people always understood that even though our local contexts, our histories and historiographies are very important and have to be attended to, and strategies have to be sort of crafted with those in mind, the overarching problems, right, are global. And so it's really important to share strategies and understandings and develop analyses that kind of incorporate the breadth of these deep problems, right, that we're facing. So I think that movements sort of know that and have developed this kind of federated schema in order to try to have the coordinating advantages of you know, a large organization while not having the detriments of being sort of slow to respond, a ton of conflict because you're all trying to do the same thing, right? Like, so there are pluses and minuses to having large centralized organizations, and federation is one of the ways to deal with that. And I think that movements are trying to do that. And that's sort of also the answer in terms of the Biden administration and the Supreme Court. The Biden administration is not going to have, there's 4 years, right? Like it's not going to be able to sort of reverse or transform what has been ongoing, right? Has been particularly punctuated in the last 4 years, but really this is a kind of politics of despair and inequality that has been festering in the US, but also the global case for decades, right? For decades. And so it can't be reversed now. What can be done now is to stop the bleeding, right? The rest, I think, will have to be done by people who are organized. You know, and over time, right? The same way that it took 10 years just to turn Georgia blue, right? You know, we're in for a generational you know, push, a generational fight. And, you know, I think that we need to be realistic about that. The other thing is that I think that we have to transcend some of the ideas of the 20th century, right? Like we have to let some things go and move on to new conceptualizations. We have to stop pretending that focusing on what we have in common means ignoring our differences, right? Because that doesn't work. It allows resentments to fester. It makes it harder to see structural relations. That is the way in which people can be advantaged and disadvantaged regardless of individual will or interpersonal interaction, right? And it makes it therefore harder to address the problems that are long-standing and will be reproduced without specific attention. So one of the things that hopefully will come in the 21st century, if we are to persist in anything like democratic societies around the world, is that we begin to face the ways that our differences advantage and disadvantage us in systematic ways, and concentrate on fixing those things, right? Instead of trying to ignore our differences and say that we're all the same, you know, et cetera. Like that's not true. Understanding that we have things in common does not necessitate that we have some kind of same flat, single plane experience. And I think that part of the reason that we've come to this crisis in America, not only in America, but also all over the world, is a part of a kind of liberal developmental fantasy that was very popular in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that we were, quote, at the end of history, and there was just going to be a upward spiral of tolerance and development that would sort of keep us in a steady state, for the foreseeable future. That sort of fantasy came up against the reality of increasing inequality, decreased responsiveness in democratic governments, an unwillingness to recognize, structural differences. In the American case, it's particularly racial differences, but around the world, we see that the sort of unwillingness to recognize deep divisions in society and sort of try to paper over them in various ways or look away from them is part of what has sort of led to people's outcry, claiming whatever they think their distinction is, and also demanding power for the people who they think share that important part of their identity, right? Whether it's a kind of nationalist identity, a racial identity, you know, a commitment to particular religious values, whatever. So I think that part of what has to happen in this century is for us to be able to talk about difference in a way that actually reflects people's lived experiences, right? Instead of trying to sort of look away to broad, quote, universal, you know, kind of values that don't help people make sense of things. I mean, because that's what where we're at, right? Like, if the politics that exist doesn't help you make sense of the world as you experience it, then it's useless to you. And you don't necessarily want to fight to uphold it, right? No matter what the sort of glossy rhetoric about democracy is, right? So that's our challenge and our choice, is to try to be honest in our politics. One of the ways that we're doing that, or people are doing that in the United States context, is to try to organize people through a race-class framework. And this is since race, particularly Black-white racial divisions, are at the very root of our cleavages in the American case, folks have begun organizing by saying, look, in order to organize people around the economic inequality that they know, right, that they experience in their lives, we have to talk about race front and center, right? Because there's already a ton of racial resentment and like sort of race talk that goes on in multiple different communities all around our country. But that also, you know, because it's not identified, it does not, you know, it's allowed to sort of fester instead of being brought to light and being dealt with.
Thank you. Well, time is rushing on. I would like to dedicate the last 15 to 20 minutes to our audience and their questions. What I'm going to do is just read a few of them out and invite you to then to comment as you see fit. One question is from Mary Pampok, and she says, Trump was eager to work with foreign countries that had a bad record of human rights, such as Saudi Arabia. Do you think that Biden will be more critical? There is another question from, let me find that again. Sorry, folks. Okay, Clemens is just helping me out here. Okay, is the electoral system still fit for purpose today, or does it unfairly skew the results? You have already spoken to that a little bit. There was also a question that I cannot find now anymore. Are there specific lessons that we can learn, and this is a question from Marilyn, that we can learn from past crisis movements, such as from the 1960s in the US, that can inform our responses to the current situation, either what strategies worked or definitely didn't work? So these are three questions that came from our audience. Whoever wants to go first to address any of them.
You want me either? Well, I'll start with the one about whether Biden will be more critical to work in terms of human rights. It's certainly my hope, and it's certainly, from everything I've seen, there's indications that he will be. I mean, he's very clearly signaled that he wants to be more multilateral, that he wants to reestablish some of the relationships with Europe and traditional allies. He has, at least on the domestic level, reaffirmed human rights and civil rights, like very clearly, as I briefly mentioned, focused on advancing LGBTQ rights, for example. You know, in his appointments has chosen people who have a background in equality, like if you think Janet Yellen, for example, or equality is something that's important to them. So my hope, and from everything I read in the tea leaves, right, I do think human rights will play a bigger role. He also has talked about reinstating the Civil Rights Office in the Department of Justice. So there are certainly indications that human rights, civil rights will be more prominent and more important. Whether this will truly translate into international relations, we'll have to see. But my inclination is that yes, he will be more critical. Yes, the human rights record will be something that will be taken into account, and also sort of shared values. With regards to some of the other questions, the Electoral College obviously is, as I said, does not promote equality, does not promote equal representation. Okay, and has been pointed out as one of the big problems. I guess it's important to kind of know the racist background in some ways of the Electoral College, and sort of this idea that there's like the founding fathers, that there's such a thing as too much democracy, right? That people might not be trusted. I'm sure you're probably aware that originally it was white landowners who were allowed to vote, and the Electoral College was kind of put in place because while the North and the slave owning South had about the same population, the South argued that basically, an enslaved person is worth 3/5 of the equation. So that's why, while a large portion of the population, basically, the Black population did not have the right to vote, they were still counted as 3/5 of the white population. And so there is something very unfair in the Electoral College. It's obviously, again, I would say, not human rights friendly or participation rights friendly. And there have been discussions on abolishing the Electoral College, or giving at least the popular vote some sort of function. Like at the moment, like if you think about it, not technically speaking, not a single American really elects the president. It's the electors that do that. Like, unless you're an elector, I guess. It's the electors that technically elect the president, not the American people. I know this might be a technicality, but it kind of shows the messiness of the process. I'll leave the question about the social movements to what we have learned to Diva. Just to say maybe one small things, like if we look at some of the most successful social movements, they have sort of had a contagion effect, right? A contagious effect around the world. Like, for example, if you think about the Arab uprising, the people there have learned the way they organized, the way they mobilized from the people in Serbia, for example. The people in Northern Ireland learned their strategy from the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So there's definitely some strategies that were learned and had great implications worldwide.
Thank you. Diva?
Well, one of the questions that just came up in the chat is one I'd like to address. Can I? Someone said how to explain the difference in popular vote, Biden versus Trump, but there are many fewer Democrats versus GOP in the congressional elections. This is the problem of gerrymandering that Tina talked about before, and another problem in our institutional system, which is anti-democratic, basically. So that means that every 10 years, whichever party controls the state houses, that is, so the state Congress, right, in Minnesota or Georgia or Arizona, they draw the congressional district maps. And that means the people who can vote for a representative in our national Congress. And parties tend to draw those boundaries in partisan ways. And the Republican Party tends to be particularly partisan about it, which means to say that they will draw district maps and create districts where the voters are sort of guaranteed to, or much more likely to, vote a certain way. And then those districts will, sort of add up to more representation for fewer voters. So that, for example, in a state like Wisconsin, you would have to have a popular vote margin of 8 or 9 points in order to get equal representation between the parties because of the way that the district maps are drawn. The bad news about that is that that won't necessarily be mitigated this year. And that's because those maps are drawn with a combination of census data, and we've just taken our census, which happens every 10 years, but those efforts have been really mitigated by the Trump administration. The census didn't run as long as it normally runs. It wasn't advertised as much as it's normally advertised. Not as many people were hired in order to make sure that folks had help to fill out the census or could be found, right, if they lived in very rural or less populous areas. Also, the Trump administration was very threatening toward migrants and undocumented people. Normally, the census is supposed to take account of both citizens and resident non-citizens, but a lot of people were kind of scared off from filling out the census. So we might not have an accurate count of the number of people who they are and where they live in the United States, which is its own problem. But the second part of that problem is that because of the gerrymandering that took place in 2010, Republicans still control more state houses than they should, given the sort of popular vote totals that happened in those states. And they will do everything that they can to preserve their power, which is over-representation of a minority position. So as I said, people who read this election as a veneration of American institutions have got it wrong. There's a lot of things that we do that are not good sense, right? Like that don't make sense if representation and equal representation is what you want. But the good thing is politically you can change many of those things, including the power of the Supreme Court. There's nothing in our Constitution that actually gives them the right to ratify laws. So there's a way in which Supreme Court decisions could be ignored, even though that's relatively radical. There's also the option of increasing the number of seats on the Supreme Court, which is a power that rests with Congress, which is also something that has been discussed. But all this is to be done. None of it's automatic.
Thank you. Allow me to read out probably 2 more questions. One is from Georg Rauchenberg, and he asks, President Trump is challenging the legal system and the election process, is ignoring results and pressing for votes to be excluded. Apart from a few brave Republicans, the GOP keeps quiet. What about the long-term effects, the long-term damage to US democracy? And another one here from... No, I don't see who it's from, but this is about, again, the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that the pandemic had a major role in the results of the election? Meaning, would the election have gone another way if there had not been a pandemic? And what do you think would have happened? Let me just see if there's one more. No, I think we have about 5 minutes left. So if you could speak to these questions and then probably also give us a brief closing statement, that would be perfect. This time, Diva, maybe you would like to start.
Well, in terms of the pandemic, I do think that the pandemic has made a large sort of difference in the election, but not the way you think. I don't think that people were sort of like automatically mobilized by the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic. Rather, I think that the shutdown that of sort of the sort of regular business and way of life that happened in the spring of 2020 allowed a massive amount of political organizing to happen, basically. And I think that that made a big difference. So, for example, the uprisings that took place in the United States and all over the world, in the United States case, the biggest uprisings we've ever had in our history, where about 26 million people came out into the streets in defense of Black lives, was an enormous organizing opportunity. And honestly, the only reason that those demonstrations were able to be that large was because our regular political economy was suspended. So people had the time to sort of come out and demonstrate and also educate themselves about politics. Even the people who didn't come out into the streets were riveted by that in a way that they normally would not have been. So I think that's the way that COVID made a difference in terms of the electoral outcomes, not because of people's automatic response to the issue. As we can see, people don't have automatic responses to issues. So, in terms of a closing statement, I think I've said what I want to say about that. Organizing is key. Keep your hand on that pulse and organize where you are because democracy depends on it more than institutions, more than ideals.
Yeah, very briefly, just to maybe add one more point to Diva's comment with regards to the pandemic. I think it really brought out into the forefront some of the underlying issues that is, especially white people tend to ignore. If you look at the numbers, like who dies, it's largely racial and ethnic minorities. So, it brought out some of the deep structural issues and helped maybe in addition to the political economy and so, people not being at work, basically, to kind of mobilize and organize people. With regards to the question about the GOP staying quiet and the long-term damage, I think it's a pattern, like that we've seen, I don't know, to me personally, it felt like every time Trump did something that hadn't been done before, my thought was, well, but he can't do that. Somebody needs to speak up, and nobody did. And so, in some ways, that the pattern, I think, in the end, what this is about power. Like what Diva just so well explained with regards to gerrymandering and those kinds of things. Like it's holding on to power. And, obviously we still have the races in Georgia that are going on. They can, I think they're part of the equation. They're really important because they might flip the Senate. So if the 2 seats are going to the Republicans, it will be very difficult for the Biden administration to get any policy through. If they go to the 2 Democrats, then, there will be a majority or there will be the likelihood that Democratic policies can be pushed through is much higher. So I think there's a little bit of everything. Obviously, a sitting president in a party in power not supporting the peaceful peaceful power, that's a problem. That's a problem. Will remain a problem. So my closing statement, I guess, is I have hope. I agree with Eva on a lot of the points. Like, I think it shows like this is kind of has been a near-death experience for democracy. And so looking where else besides our institution and sort of the top level, right? Where else can we organize? Where else can we bring save US democracy? I think that will be the key going forward.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening already for us, morning for you guys. My biggest thanks goes out to the 2 panelists. Thank you for taking the time to come and speak to us at a crucial point in time, speaking about the connections between between the local, the national, the global, and making us understand, how the social fabric of the US is related to global issues around political change and transformations of democracy. That's an insight that we don't often get. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience for tuning in and asking excellent questions. I wish we could go on, but I guess we're all spending a lot of time in front of the screen anyways. I hope this is a conversation that we can continue. Thank you also to Clemens and Laura and Petra and everybody who has helped me organize here at OIIP. All right, I wish everyone a good evening, and I wish you a good start to your Monday and the rest of the day, and hope to see you again in one of our formats.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.